Good morning. I'm Vicki Kennedy, and on behalf of our President, Dr. Mary Grant, and the Board of Directors, I am so pleased to welcome you to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. We're delighted that you're all here for our first breakfast edition of our Getting to the Point series. It's great to see so many new and old friends, hi guys, in the audience this morning. Elected officials, community leaders, friends of the Kennedy Institute. It's no secret that my husband, the late Senator Edward Kennedy, loved the United States Senate. He said so often that serving the people of Massachusetts, being elected by the people of Massachusetts, was the greatest honor of his life. He believed passionately that the United States Senate had the power to improve the lives of men and women, not only in this country, but around the world. So 15 years ago, when my husband first contemplated the creation of this institute, he envisioned a place that would educate the public in a hands-on, experiential way about the important role of the United States Senate in our democracy. That's why he insisted on this replica of the Senate chamber. He wanted citizens, he wanted you and me, to be able to walk onto the floor, to feel the awe, to sense the majesty of this place, and to think about the people, the giants who had come before us. He wanted us to remember the hard work and dedication of men and women of goodwill in both parties who came together to address the greatest challenges facing our nation. He wanted this place to highlight the need for civil discourse and compromise. He wanted to encourage active participation, and in the process, he hoped to inspire a new generation of leaders. All of us knew as we immersed ourselves in the planning of this laboratory of democracy that our mission and Teddy's vision were important, but none of us realized then how vital that mission and that vision would become. So I thank you for being here this morning, for being engaged citizens, and for supporting the work of this institute. Today, we're honored by the presence of one of the new generation of leaders my husband had in mind when he first envisioned this place, a man who was himself both inspired by and inspiring to Ted Kennedy. Our speaker this morning is a man of extraordinary accomplishment and ability, a public servant who speaks with moral clarity and the courage of his convictions, a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, a Peace Corps volunteer, a former assistant district attorney, a husband and father of two precious children. Our special guest was elected in 2012 to the U.S. House of Representatives from the 4th District of Massachusetts. He quickly distinguished himself on Capitol Hill as a workhorse and not a show horse, and earned the admiration of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And because of his passionate advocacy for decent health care and mental health treatment, for common sense gun reforms, for an immigration policy worthy of the highest ideals of this nation, and for equal rights for all Americans, regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, physical or intellectual ability, to name a few key issues. He has also won the respect and admiration of the people of his district and of this nation. I will never forget his passionate response when the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives called the repeal of the Affordable Care Act an act of mercy. With all due respect, he said, the Speaker and I must have read different scripture. The one I read calls on us to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, and to comfort the sick. It reminds us that we are judged not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we care for the least among us. There is no mercy in a system that makes health care a luxury, he continued. There is no mercy in a country that turns its back on those most in need of protection, the elderly, the poor, the sick, and the suffering. There is no mercy in a cold shoulder to the mentally ill. This is not an act of mercy. It is an act of malice. Wow. The video of his passionate comments went viral, getting more than 10 million views. I couldn't be prouder or more honored to welcome him here this morning to this institute that bears his great-uncle's name, his great-uncle who adored him and knew, as I know, that he was going to make an enormous difference in the world. Please join me in welcoming him now, the Congressman for the 4th District of Massachusetts, Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy III. And please also welcome our moderator, the Deputy Bureau Chief of Washington's Boston Globe, the award-winning journalist who covers politics and the White House, our own Matt Viser. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's a thrill to be here. Normally, I am kind of in that corner there, so it's very exciting to be on the floor of the Senate here. I wanted to start with something fairly topical. Congressman, you have 2 children, both under the age of 3, and on Father's Day, you took a trip to the border where many children there were unable to be with their fathers. This story of what is happening on our border right now is capturing the attention of the nation. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, first, what brought you there, and also a little bit about what you saw and what that trip was like.
Happy to. Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you, and grateful for the opportunity. To the EMK Institute, thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to have a discussion here. I think you all heard why Vicki is my favorite aunt. Thank you. Grateful for everything, and thank you for all that you've done to make this possible. Thank you. Thank you. Please give her a big round of applause. It was not how I expected to spend Father's Day. I think, along with a lot of you and a lot of Americans, have been following what's been going on on our southern border, with an increasing sense of outrage, sadness, and disappointment. And one of my closest friends in Congress happens to represent part of that community, El Paso, and a good portion of our border with Mexico, and Beto O'Rourke. And he called me up on, so we've been having a number of conversations about what was going on and trying to cut through a lot of the cloud of information that is out there. And so we've been talking about it a lot. And then he reached out on Saturday morning, kind of mid-morning, and said, hey, we're putting together a rally. We want to have you there. Like about 10 or 11 in the morning on Saturday. Which was great. My wife had actually planned, it was going to be my first Father's Day with our 6-month-old, and we had some plans, and I kind of tucked that in the back of my mind and said, well, let me see how the day goes before I float this one with Lauren. And a little while later, as the plan started to come together, I mentioned it to her and just said, hey, this is coming together. What do you think? And look, we don't get to spend a whole lot of quiet weekends together. We don't get to, particularly as a family at the moment, with a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old. And so we're really looking forward to how I think a lot of Americans were going to spend that day. And she said, and I talked to my brother, got a twin brother, Matt, they both kind of framed it this way and said, if you're in this job, you're in it for a reason, and if you're not going to fight on this, what are you going to fight for? So I was on a 5 a.m. flight on Sunday morning to Dallas and then El Paso. Got to El Paso, raced down to Tornillo, where one of these detention facilities was held, one of the first tent cities that is coming up. where a couple thousand people had driven through the night from all over southwestern United States, Salt Lake City, Austin, all across Texas, to come together for this rally, the march and rally. And this literally, the authorities wouldn't let us in, so gathered outside a rock wall, a little patch of dirt. And Matt, it was kind of an amazing scene. They ended up having speakers step up on a speaker so that you could see out over the crowd that were packed in pretty tight. And to listen to some of the stories of the people that had come so far and the energy of folks that were there, just saying particularly on Father's Day, a celebration of family, this is clearly, Democrats don't love their kids more than Republicans do. This is not a partisan attack. There is a base level of humanity that connects parents to children, which makes what we are doing all the more incomprehensible, and makes the administration's denials that that is actually what we are doing all the more enraging. Because there is no doubt, contrary to what the President of the United States has said, contrary to what his Secretary of Homeland Security has said, that this is the policy of the United States of American government. And if there's any doubt on that, that's what the officials told me when I was down there. They wouldn't let us in. A couple of them came out. And they lamented the misinformation and said, you know, the press is distorting this and members of Congress are distorting this. And so I say, okay, fine. So tell me what's going on. One person tells you one thing, another person tells you something else. All right, with all due respect, ma'am, that's different than what the other guy just said. How about you let us in and we just see it? Yeah, I can't do that. Love to have you in. Come back sometime. But can't do it now. Okay, I wouldn't want people showing up at my office demanding to go like see how I kept my desk either. How about I come back in 2 hours? Yeah, I can't do that. How long do you need? 2 weeks. El Paso's a long way. Why do you need 2 weeks? We just need 2 weeks. Okay, well, who's inside? One person tells you one thing, absolutely no unaccompanied minors, or absolutely no children that have been separated from their families, just unaccompanied minors. Okay, but I understand that the government is now deeming it so that if a parent comes with a child and crosses illegally, they are subject to arrest, and you are now classifying the child that they are with as unaccompanied. Are any of those children here? All we have is unaccompanied minors. Well, are any of those children that are classified as unaccompanied minors here? All we have is unaccompanied minors. Around and around and around. If there is a silver lining to this, which I'm not so sure there is, but if there is one, it is that there is a sense of outrage that is building across this country that, again, is not partisan. When you start seeing Ted Cruz, Beto O'Rourke's opponent, by the way, for the U.S. Senate, Beto organizes a rally, and all of a sudden Ted Cruz introduces a bill saying, hey, we should stop that practice. If there was any doubt that this is a frustration that is building across the political spectrum, I do hope that that this crescendos soon and that the administration will change their policy, which, by the way, the president could do with a single phone call.
And this policy does seem to not have that much support. I mean, two-thirds of Americans do not support this. What, in your mind, should happen in the event where a parent is coming with a child and they're in the country illegally? What is the ideal scenario in that circumstance?
So let's start with the basics. One, under no scenario is the right answer, you separate a parent from the child, period, right? None. Two, to the extent that our Republican colleagues are about to frame one of their immigration bills that we might vote on later this week, although they haven't, at least as I've seen, released text of one of those bills yet, which is a nice trick. Their solution has been throw them all in jail together. I don't really think that's appropriate for a 3-year-old either. So I think we can start with a base case of what's not appropriate. We can then build to a question of what is. Now here's the challenge. This is a legitimately hard issue. This came to a head several years ago when the unaccompanied minor crisis peaked under our Obama administration. At that time, I actually went down with a number of Republican colleagues and Democratic colleagues to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. We visited the capitals there. We went out into some of the parts that we could access. You heard what was going on, at least some version of it. And it's hard. Right? In the Guatemalan highlands, the level of instability and violence and human trafficking that is forcing a largely indigenous population to flee is not something that you are going to solve necessarily by policies on the U.S.-Mexico border. This is too hard and too complex. San Pedro Sula in Honduras has been one of the murder capitals in the Western Hemisphere for years. You're not going to solve that on the border of the U.S. and Mexico either. I think if you start to peel back the layers of this, you realize there's reasons why people are fleeing, one, and there's reasons why they're coming here, two. And we can, in fact, start to dive into those issues. Two things that I would point out on that. One, that's a foreign policy. Part of that solution is foreign policy. I don't think it helps when you alienate every ally that we have and you don't fully fund or flush out or staff the State Department. Two, at least in my opinion, an awful lot of the instability that is being generated in these regions is a result of a narcotics trade. Estimates between the United States and Mexico alone for heroin range between 30 billion to nearly double that a year in just heroin. The response, even under Obama administration, was a plan that said we're going to spend $1 billion in these three countries, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, over a series of years. With all due respect to the Obama administration, that's not going to come close to cutting it. If you want to address this, you need to do much stronger relationships with law enforcement, with military, with governance, civil society, and we need to get the way that we think of a drug epidemic on our streets under control. We need to rethink that as the public health emergency that it is. The last piece I'd say to this, Matt, under no solution here is cutting Medicaid, the largest payer of mental behavioral health and addiction services in this country, is gutting it by $800 billion, a solution, which, by the way, they also are trying to do. So with all due respect to my Republican colleagues, you are nowhere close to a solution on this, and under no circumstance is taking out the frustration of our inability and unwillingness to solve it on a 2-year-old child acceptable response from the United States government. So let's start by actually looking at the challenges, understanding the complexities, and then go forward as I think people expect the most powerful government in the world would.
Our country right now feels quite divided into different tribes.
I hadn't noticed.
There's Fox viewers, there's MSNBC viewers, and Mrs. Kennedy alluded to this about your great uncle, Senator Kennedy, and his legacy of bipartisanship, the civil discourse and compassion. And he had a reputation where, John McCain, Orrin Hatch, so many senators who vehemently would disagree with him on political issues had a great respect for him on an individual basis. And I'm curious from you, now that you've been in Congress for 6 years, if you're noticing any of that. Do you have Republican colleagues who you can legitimately work with, talk to? Are there Trump supporters that you are in dialogue with?
So, yes, on all of that. Some of my closest friends in Washington are Republicans. We disagree on a lot of policy. They're still good and decent people. This is one of those jobs where, yes, it gets hard because some of the policies and the values and the way we approach issues ends up at loggerheads. And if they didn't feel passionately about these issues, they wouldn't have gone through the challenge of running for office. And if I didn't feel passionately about them, I wouldn't either. You do have to build up some level of kind of separation of the policy from the person, which again can be difficult to do. And on some issues, sometimes, depending on the person, it ruptures. But some of my closest friends are Republicans, and I value those relationships. It's important for me to be able to take the temperature of some of those folks, to understand, hey, as I view this issue, whether it's immigration or particularly healthcare, mental health issues, what do you hear when I say it? How is it that you're interpreting it? Understanding that they are, no matter how I feel about their own views, they are giving voice to the views of several 100,000 Americans whose voice is just as legitimate as mine. And even if I disagree with them, I do think that the voice of those Americans deserves to be heard and deserves to count, and they count just as much as my constituents do. And so my job is to try to see if there's a way to bridge that gap. And on a number of these issues, there might not be. But I do think that on a number of them, there are. And if you could take some of the politics out of it, you could get much further along. Here's one example. So, a little over a year ago, I'm in the gym in the morning, which is where like any good bipartisan stuff actually happens. And I overhear a senior Republican talking to a newly elected Republican. And he's talking about, we're in the midst of this healthcare repeal effort. And he's a senior Republican that's supposed to know something about healthcare. So I kind of bite my tongue through all of this. Tried to.
And are you on an elliptical, or what are you doing?
I'm going to leave the details of this out, but thank you. Regardless, thank you, Matt. Regardless, he starts explaining to the newly elected individual that what we need to do in our healthcare system is move off a volume-based system where individuals are compensated, doctors, providers compensated, for the number of procedures that are prescribed, and move towards one that actually measures quality. And so we move to outcomes, and you try to make sure that you're getting a higher quality of care that's actually delivered. And he goes through some of the details around that. And after about a 3-minute explanation, I just couldn't help myself. I said, that's the best endorsement of the Affordable Care Act I've ever heard by a Republican. And he said, oh, well, that's why we need to keep that part. It's like, pal, that's the part. Like, that's what it does. Might not be perfect, but that's what it tries to do. 2 observations about that. 1, if you didn't call it the ACA or Obamacare, there's actually a fair amount of support for it. 2, there was a newly elected Republican that hated Obamacare and has no idea what it actually is. And it's something that I talked to a very well-respected Republican right after the repeal vote failed in the House the first time. And then after reconciliation instructions, the means by which Republicans were trying to repeal the bill in both the House and the Senate with just a majority vote, failed in September 30th. So same individual, week or so after both of those incidents. And I said, look, both times, I know now is not appropriate, but if at some point you think we're really willing to turn the page and actually try to chip away at ways that you can make healthcare more accessible, more affordable to your constituents and mine, let me know. His response was the same. We have to lose an election first. You cannot say to the American public that this is the worst bill ever passed by man. Fail to do it, pick yourself up and say, okay, we'll just protect it. I hope that's coming in November.
Along those lines, earlier this year, you had said about President Trump, to give him credit, he had his finger on the pulse of something that most people didn't see or feel. Democrats need to do that too. And I wonder if Democrats right now are seeing or feeling something that part of the energy feels like it's anti-Trump. But is there, what are Democrats seeing and feeling that is a convincing argument, not only in the midterms, but in 2020?
So I think a couple of things. One, I think unquestionably there is an anti-Trump energy and wave that is a powerful force in certain segments of our country, certainly in Massachusetts, kind of writ large, although there's pockets in Massachusetts where President Trump is still strongly supported. President Trump got, I believe it was 1 million more votes in our state than Charlie Baker did, and he's the most popular governor in the country. So for those in the room that might think that this is a phenomenon that is someplace else, there's a base of support for President Trump even here. Now, he happens to be largely unpopular in this state, but there's still plenty of fellow Bay Staters that cast a vote for him. And so I think 2 things to that. One, I do think writ large, how this administration has tried to go about governing is antithetical to an awful lot of what a number of Americans believe and what the values that we hold here in Massachusetts. Education, he's going right at that. He's suing Harvard University. He's rolled back a lot of protections through the Department of Education and a number of efforts that the Obama administration put forth. Healthcare, obviously tried to repeal it. Immigration has been devastating to parts of our country and to communities, particularly here in Massachusetts. I mean, issue after issue after issue, LGBT rights, equality, everything. That being said, there is, I think, a strong wave of anti-Trump sentiment. That being said, I think it is important, again, for us to recognize, I'll give you one story. Well, important to recognize that there is a segment of our country that still strongly believes in the message that Donald Trump is putting forward, as difficult as that might be for me to understand. A buddy of mine, Republican buddy of mine from Arkansas, told me, yes, in the gym about a month ago, that he had done a poll in his district, again, probably about a month or 6 weeks ago, and tested the favorability, unfavorability rating of President Trump in his district. Any idea what it was? Republican representative from Arkansas for Republican primary voters.
I mean, the conventional wisdom is still pretty high. It would be 80%.
94. 94. I've never heard of 94 anything in politics. So that's not a political favorability rating. That is a visceral connection that, again, it's Republican primary voters in a Republican district in Arkansas, right? So that's not necessarily going to be reflective of the overall, the kind of middle-of-the-road American voter. But I think it's still valuable for us to keep in mind that there are other American citizens that believe wholeheartedly in a message that is coming out. And it's worth trying to understand what it is that they're hearing and seeing. My own interpretation of that. One, I think most Americans will want a government that's got your back, right? That says, regardless of who you are, language that you speak, country that you came from, color of your skin, God of your prayers, gender of your spouse, that we see you, you count. We hear you, we want you on the field, we stand by you. And look, those are the civil rights and protections that Democrats stand pretty strong for and are known for, and if there's any critique, it's that we stand too strong on those. But I think Democrats are pretty good on that. The second piece that I think might have gotten lost in the wash a little bit is that if you cannot provide for your family, nothing else really matters. And so with the dignity that comes with those civil rights, there's an economic dignity that has to come with it too. And that means making sure that every single person in our country who wants a job should be able to find one that keeps a roof over your head, food on your plate, your kid in a good school, and a safe and secure retirement. And if we're not able to do that, if the most powerful nation in the world at a time of 3.5% unemployment, if we can't do that now, then we have, I think, some deep thinking about how the structures of our society are actually touching individuals that are struggling to compete in a rapidly shifting economic, global, technological environment and revolution that we find ourselves in the midst of.
You're fairly close with Nancy Pelosi, and I had we did a poll of the, I think it's the 5th congressional district where Nikki Song is now representing, and there's about 37 candidates running to replace her.
It's a little late for you to announce, but you probably could jump in.
And I was struck in that poll, 88% disapprove. This is among Democratic primary voters. 88% disapproved of President Trump, but only 27% said that they would like to see Nancy Pelosi become House Speaker, which I was struck by given the politics of that district. And do you think, I mean, within the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi will become the leader or will become the House Speaker should Democrats win in November?
I sure want to give Nancy Pelosi the chance, right? And so, look, I think I'm a strong believer in Leader Pelosi. I think there's, like any leader and any public official, you've got your strengths. We've got our areas for improvement. The reason why, when she was challenged a year and a half ago, she won over 2/3 of the support of our caucus, was that our caucus sees part of the way that she handles our caucus, the parts of the way that she handles the responsibilities of that job that aren't necessarily as outward facing, and believes that she's still pretty damn good at it. And so I've been in the rooms with Leader Pelosi where sometimes these issues and issues within our caucus and kind of inter-family squabbles can get fairly heated. There's nobody better. There's nobody tougher. She, when she needs to, puts razor blades on those knuckles and knows how to throw a punch. And Matt, I'll tell you a story. When I first got to Congress, I went around and stopped in and visited with a number of Democrats and Republicans that had been around for a long time to kind of go introduce myself, do a little bit of the kiss the ring, and get their advice. And so I'm sitting down with a Republican who's been there for a long time, not in leadership, but been there for a long time. And we're about to go vote, and so he's got the television on in his room with the House floor so that we can see when the votes are called. And the votes are about to get called. It's Leader Pelosi speaking at the podium. And in the midst of a conversation about something else, this gentleman stops and says, "The leader of our party ain't half the leader that she is." And I went, "I'm sorry, what?" And he said, "Listen, I disagree with Nancy Pelosi on almost everything. But she acquires political power to do what she believes is right. Our party acquires political power to keep it." I can't think of a better summary of the current dynamic of politics in Washington today than that, and that came from a Republican.
I'm going to resist making a chapstick joke here.
I think too late, actually.
But you gave the response to the State of the Union address, which is something that has derailed probably more political careers than it has helped. Marco Rubio lunging for water, Steve Beshear with this sort of an awkward background of stone-faced people. What can you tell us a little bit about the bar for that speech, and particularly given your family's history and reputation for oratory, and the bar is not low in that either. So how did you prepare for that? What was that speech like? Did you immediately agree to do it?
Yeah, if only a member of my family told me to go easy on the chapstick, it would have been a little bit easier, but oh well. So it's kind of a funny story. I think I'll get these details more or less right. The week before, 8 or 9 days before that speech, we were held over for a weekend in Washington for a potential shutdown vote. And we're in a caucus meeting, I believe it was Sunday morning, and in the basement of the Capitol, and Leader Pelosi says, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something." And I went, "Okay, what's up?" And she said, "Not here, we'll talk later." I went, "Okay," which happens from time to time, but not all that often. And we're on the floor voting that evening, and I see her and I said, "Hey, did you need to ask me something?" And she said, "Yes, but not here." And I say, "Okay," and I follow her off the floor of the House of Representatives into the cloakroom, and the little kind of reception area that there's one for Republicans, one for Democrats right off the floor. And I stop and she goes, "Not here." And she goes out the back door, which goes straight into her, which is a bit of a long walk into her office. And at that point, I make eye contact with a couple of staff members and go, "Am I in trouble? What did I do?" Called into the principal's office. And they just give me a shrug. And so we kind of make pleasantries, small talk as we go on this walk that seems like it's forever. And we go into her office. She's got a couple of holding rooms in the leadership office. We take a hard right into this room where there's already a glass of water sitting on the table, and she kicks out all of her staff. And now I go, yikes. So we're still voting, so I know this isn't going to be a long conversation, but I don't know what's coming next. And she said, I'd like to ask you something that I think is an extraordinary honor, and of course, the answer to this is going to be yes, of course. And she asks if I'd be willing to give the speech. And of course, I said, yes, absolutely, I'd be honored. I know the history of that speech just as well as you do, and the first thought that went through my mind was my career's over. But of course I said, yes, absolutely, I'd be thrilled. So she said, great, and we got to work on a couple things, but great. And so that's Sunday for the speech following Tuesday, so 10 days or so away. So I say thank you. I'm so grateful for this honor. I'll do my best and all the rest of it. And let's touch base to make sure that you're finally comfortable with this and all the rest of it. And that was going to happen, I think, later that night or the next morning. And I go back into the cloakroom and I text the senior members of my staff and I say, we need to talk. And so they jump on the phone and I went, so this is what happened. And I said, yes, you guys need to figure this out. And so they jumped to it pretty quickly. And in a matter of kind of 2 or 3 days, a day or two after the speech came together, the invitation was extended. What Leader Pelosi did, which was extremely helpful to me, was say a lot of these, not Governor Beshear obviously, but a number of the other ones, had been done traditionally as an individual speaking directly to a camera for 7, 8, 9 minutes, which, unless you're Robert De Niro, is a really hard thing to do. And I quite candidly knew that that wasn't going to be, I can't do that. And so we wanted to, when she said, hey, you don't have to do this in Washington, right? You can do it someplace else. That gave us the ability to try to look at this as a bit differently, and to understand that no matter who the president is, no matter their level of oratorical skill, you're never going to be able to recreate the atmosphere of a president speaking to the nation from the House of Representatives in a packed chamber. You just can't do it. So don't try, right? Just come at it differently. And so that was kind of the thought that went into the setting. And then the speech itself, I had kind of given half of that speech before, and I'd given the second half before. And what I wanted to try to do was to pull those pieces together, and understanding that the president in all likelihood was going to put context to his first year in office and try to explain what he had succeeded, how he had succeeded, and what his vision was going forward, was to say, that's great, and that's his opportunity. I believe there's another narrative here which tells a very different story. And so let's put that context for the other narrative.
And did you hear from President Trump before or after that speech? And have you ever heard from him? I mean,
No.
Have you? No.
No.
No dialogue.
No. No. No.
Do you follow him on Twitter?
No. No. No nickname yet. But.
And do you, do you feel like as you observe politics and participate in politics, do you feel like people react to him differently? Are there things that members of Congress do to draw attention in a different way than they would have under President Obama, via Twitter, via name calling? I mean, how has politics changed on a day-to-day basis, do you feel like, for you because of President Trump?
So that's a hard one, I guess. Look, on the one hand, I think, candidly, my role is different. The role of most Democrats are different, right? I have always been in the minority in the House of Representatives, and so if I want to get a bill passed, I need Republicans not only to support it, but to help champion it, to be able to get floor time to pass a bill. And by the way, I hope to have one of my bills passed by voice vote later this evening. So go from here down to DC to manage the floor to pass a bill. So you can still do this. There's opportunities for it, and if you craft the right bill, and I think are willing to hear how a Republican needs to think about it, view it, critique it, there's ways to do some of this on smaller pieces of legislation at the moment. The reality, though, for my first several years was that there was still a Democratic president. So as Republicans would put through these messaging bills that I wholeheartedly disagreed with, it didn't matter because, and they knew it too, President Obama wasn't going to sign it. That's changed. And so we can't just sit there and say, hey, that's great, you want to repeal the Affordable Care Act for the 60th time, go nuts, it's not going anywhere. It might. And there's a lot that they can do through the agency process and executive power that can undermine the integrity of the law. And though, because we don't have the legislative power other than a filibuster in the Senate, our tool essentially is a microphone. And that microphone is not nearly as powerful as the White House press office and the President of the United States. And again, acknowledging that, look, media and dynamics have changed, he uses Twitter extremely effectively in order to get his views across the American public. Extremely effectively. I disagree with almost everything he says in it. But he's in a constant conversation on the points that he wants and he chooses with his supporters and the media which chooses to amplify his message in a way that he doesn't have to take questions from anybody else. It's a one-way ticket of communication that is enormously powerful. And it's awfully hard for us to compete with it. And so we got to try to find a way to do that. And I think part of the issues that I'm trying, along with everybody else, is to say, how do you meet that without without degrading the office or the integrity of the job or the honor of the seat that you hold by resorting into just the name calling and the ad hominem attack that I think is pretty easy to fall into, but it might make you feel better at the moment, but does not change anything in the long run and actually just sours the discourse. And look, it's hard sometimes to find that line between leveling legitimate, tough criticism because of the choices like they are doing on the border and calling that inhumane and degrading and horrible and a contradiction of American values, without kind of going one step further and crossing that line into an ad hominem attack. It can be hard and tempting, but I think we got to try to find a way to hold it.
Phil Johnston, the former Democratic chairman of the party in Massachusetts, a friend of the Kennedy family, said in 2015, young Joe is at the moment the protector of the legacy. And I wonder, as you think about your last name and what that means in politics generally, you've spent much of your first couple of years, as a workhorse and not a show horse. I wouldn't necessarily call you a show horse now, but you do seem to be finding your moments. The Paul Ryan moment, going to the border, you seem to be taking on a more public role. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution for you and the issue set that seems to drive that?
Sure. One, as I said, I think the role has changed a bit. I would say that if President Obama tried to take healthcare away from 30 million people or tried to rip families away from their children away from their parents, I would have criticized that too. Turns out he tried to do the opposite, and I agree with him. So, the observation that there's a more public role, absolutely. I do think that's kind of the lone tool we have left in the toolbox to try to push back against policies and values that I disagree with. So part of that is, I think, just kind of the nature of the times. So I think the role and opportunities in Congress have changed. And kind of how I've gone about part of the job has changed. That being said, I passed a bill on the first day of the Trump administration that passed out of the House of Representatives by voice vote. We've got a bill again, hopefully today, that with any luck will pass by voice vote. We're working on a couple of other bills with Republican colleagues that one of them else that I think will pass on a suspension, so non-controversial, to help individuals get access to benefits from the federal government through use of technology. Senator Warren passed a bill to try to make hearing aids more affordable about a year or so ago. I was the Democratic sponsor in the House on that bill. We worked with Marsha Blackburn. So there are ways that you can go about doing this on the legislative side to try to chip away at this logjam and this frustration I think the American public feels. With regards to kind of the legacy question, with all due respect to Phil, no, no, I'm not. Right? No one person defends that legacy. Right? My family means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and many of those I'm extremely proud of the contribution that they've made to our country. But if you try to measure yourself against President Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Ted Kennedy or Joe Kennedy, my namesake, or Eunice Kennedy Shriver, or a whole lot of others, Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith that helped with the peace process in Northern Ireland, that's a tough one. They set the bar kind of high, right? So I do think that how I interpret that message was everybody has a way to contribute. It is a great country, but that country is the sum of those contributions that its people make. We can all find our way to make our country a bit better. And your responsibility is to do the best you can to do that. And look, my life at the moment is pretty full. We got a 6-month-old and a 2.5-year-old, and the 6-month-old has decided that 2 a.m. is a good time to wake up, because, like, hey, why not? Because no one else is awake either. Just go back to bed, right? And half my time's in Washington, half my time's here. Life's busy. But I throw myself at this with everything I've got, because I think that's, if you want the job, that's kind of your responsibility to do. And fight for the values that you hold dearly, and healthcare and immigration and Medicaid and mental health, and the overall kind of umbrella there of saying, look, our country is supposed to provide every single person here a shot. And it turns out that if you are wealthy and have access to power, you have your shot, but you can do that largely on your own. A lot of folks that are struggling with mental illness or poverty or systemic racism and injustice that is ingrained in our system struggle to. And that's where our government should be devoting the majority of their work, because we do have the power to change it. So you try.
On that note, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Over here.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you so much, Representative Kennedy, for all the wonderful work you do. This has been a real pleasure to listen to you speak on so many important issues. I wrote down one that's near and dear to my heart. Can you please speak about your concerns on climate change and the threat to our natural resources, particularly by the Trump administration and the EPA? I can't even mention the name of the head of it. Thank you.
So we'll start with something that is you don't hear in Congress all that often. Climate change is real. Science actually exists, and we should believe in that science. Now, that is actually a controversial 3 sentences from a wide number of my Republican colleagues, which has been staggering. I sat my first term on the Science Committee, and there were people on that committee that just, quite frankly, don't believe in science. So that is the context of the legislative process in which we find ourselves. One, I don't think there is a larger, greater systemic threat to our prosperity as a nation and as a planet than climate change, period. Right? We have to, as a country, lead the way on this, and one of the great challenges, the great blunders, I guess, of Trump's administration was pulling out of Paris. We are in a very small select group of countries that has not verified or validated those accords, and one of them was because it didn't go far enough. Right? So there are headlines, as you see in the Boston Globe, at least once a week, about how our communities here aren't prepared for the impacts of sea level rise or systemic flooding or these storms that we can expect to come. The impacts of our local economies on fish migration, lobstermen, all the rest of it. These are issues that we are going to be struggling with if we don't do anything about it. So it is a major systemic challenge. Republicans have indicated that they will do nothing to address this concern as long as they are in power. So I don't want to make this too political, but if you do care about this, this is one of the reasons why we have to win. Last thing I would say, though, one of the areas where I think we have fallen short, Democrats, and then as a country, is at a time of this economic upheaval, we continue to frame global climate change as a global issue, which obviously it is. But you don't frame it as a local issue, right? So when people are saying, hey, that's great, the ice caps might be melting, but I can't afford food on my plate for my family. The ice caps we can fix later, I gotta get them fed. The way we need to reframe that issue is recognizing that in Fall River, Massachusetts, they are going to be spending millions and millions of dollars paying for infrastructure upgrades because of combined sewage overflow and wastewater runoff to meet EPA mandates, because that is going to be passed on to their residents in assessments, in taxes, not because Fall River has done anything wrong, but because our government is not adapting to the impacts of climate change. So when they get that assessment, when they get that tax bill, when they realize that they're going to be on the hook for millions of dollars in fines and fees, and they sit there and say, hey, this is Fall River's fault, a city with a median household income of $34,000 a year, that's not Fall River's fault. That's the United States government's failure to actually adapt and change and adapt to the challenges of climate change. Flood rates, same problem. But frame those issues, those local ones, as a climate change, as a ramification or impact of climate change, and it's an entirely different discussion to have, rather than trying to reinforce some neoliberal world order of 192 nations and a compact in Paris. This is about as granular and as a pocketbook issue as it gets. So let's reframe that discussion.
One area, as my colleague David Abel has written, ironically is not prepared for climate change, is Mar-a-Lago. It's right on the ocean. We'll go to next question upstairs. There's someone right here. Wait for the mic, if you will.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, fine. Do you mind passing this down? I asked you about things like hunger and putting food on the table and the work requirements for SNAP, but in listening to you, you were talking about messaging and messaging bills. One of the stories I read yesterday about what was going on at the border was a 16-year-old girl who has been teaching the fellow detainees, these girls that she is being imprisoned with, how to change diapers because the staff is not able to change the diapers. Now, as I was reading this, and I actually threw it up onto a messaging board, and so I'm actually going to ask you about messaging. In my mind, this girl who has been taken away from her parents and is changing diapers and is the father of a 6-month-old and a 2.5-year-old, I think you know a little bit about changing diapers, and is probably is doing something for the people around her and everything like that, and probably more deserving of citizenship than some of those people who are, shall we say, born on third base and think they hit a triple. And one of the paths to citizenship is an act of Congress. And I would actually like to suggest that to you. You do not have to respond to this, but I figured I would take the opportunity. That this 16-year-old girl probably deserves citizenship for being a good American already.
Great point. Look, the larger point that I think you make is the one that, writ large, our nation is struggling with, right? Which is a question these days of what is it that we actually owe each other? What responsibilities? Citizen to citizen, and government to citizen, and citizen to government. And that, I think, framing the tensions and the partisanship that we see across the country that way starts to put a lot more of these debates and the divisiveness of our politics in context, where a Trump administration has answered that question very clearly, which is you don't owe anybody anything. And if we take the shackles of citizenship off, the responsibilities of citizenship off, you will succeed. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. That with this country, the greatest one in the world, comes responsibilities of citizenship because you are going to have the blessings of being a citizen of the United States of America. And whether it's an individual that is finding in the midst of detention, in some place she should never be, doing something that she should never have to, still finds a way to recognize the humanity of people that she had never met, is a pretty powerful statement about what I actually think gets to the heart of almost every single American's values. And I don't think, the amazing thing about that part is that's not a partisan critique. I don't think many of my Republican colleagues would actually disagree with that. The question that we have is, the responsibility that I have, is how do we get these discussions and debates and the framework of these discussions to that level on values and not on policy. We have seen, even with something as divisive as immigration policy, which for Republicans is arguably even harder to deal with than healthcare, we've seen that when it comes to separating children from their parents, even they are saying you can't do that. So there is a value we have, despite the fact that they haven't done anything about it yet. There is a value that we have there. We got to fight for it.
And we have time for one more question. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more. There's a guy up in the skybox there.
Thank you, Representative Kennedy, for this program. I saw your speech on Father's Day commiserating with the immigrants who have been separated from their children. You were clearly passionate about this issue, and I'm impressed with your fluency in Spanish also. You must know that since 2000, 10,000 Palestinian children have been detained by Israeli forces. Children aged 11 to 15 have been abused and separated from their parents for months at a time. The McCollum bill, submitted in November 2017, prohibits U.S. assistance to Israel from being used to support the military detention and ill treatment of Palestinian children. 27 representatives have so far signed on. Why have you not signed on?
Thanks for the question, sir. I wasn't aware of the bill, so I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. I'll certainly take a look at it. As you know, there's thousands of bills that are filed every year in Congress, and our staff, our team tries to keep up as best we can. Oftentimes it takes somebody flagging a bill to just say, hey, this bill is out there, take a look at the policy and see if it's something that we can support. So, look, detention of children writ large, I have a hard time believing is the appropriate policy response to basically anything. I'm very happy to take a look at the bill. I'll flag it for our team as I get down to Washington today, and we'll take a look at the text. I appreciate you flagging it for me. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Congressman Kennedy for being here, and it's been an honor to be here as well. And I want to turn it over just quickly to Dr. Grant for some final remarks. But thank you again.
Matt, pleasure. Thank you.
How about a round of applause for Matt Visor for his excellent discussion. Matt, thank you for being here. Vicki, as always, thank you for helping to realize the vision of the Kennedy Institute and your leadership here. Congressman, thank you for reminding us that we can all make a difference. When this institute was opened, you were a part of it. So many of you in this room helped shape it. That's what the purpose of the Kennedy Institute is about, one of the many purposes, to remember that we can come together. We can focus on what keeps us together, about humanity, that it is not an issue of Republican or Democrat. It's about what's in the best interest of our nation and our country and our people. Congressman, thank you for doing that, for reminding us and for being here with us and for being not only an inspirational leader, but a wonderful dad. Clearly you are. I invite all of you to keep coming back, to take out a membership, to join us in this work. We're delighted to have you here with us this morning, midday, in the evening, on weekends. You help make this happen. And together, when we work on the things that matter, the things that bring us together as opposed to separate us, we can make our best difference. There is a responsibility that comes with citizenship. And that means we can begin that responsibility by having conversations today and every day when you leave here. So take this good energy and remember that every one of us can make a difference on the issues that separate us by bringing us together. I thank you for coming. I wish you all a wonderful, beautiful summer day here. Congressman, thank you for your leadership and good luck with the Onshore Act. We hope that that is a big success for you today. Thank you for leading us so well. Have a great day, everybody.